Today, I'm glad to present Andreea Bobu. Andreea is an assistant professor at MIT in the Astro and Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She leads the Collaborative Learning and Autonomy Research Lab, where they develop autonomous agents that learns to do tasks from and with around people. And her goal is to ensure that these agents' behavior is consistent with human expectations, whether they interact with expert designers or novice users. She obtained a Ph.D. in electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley with Anca Dragan in 2023. And prior to her PhD, she earned her bachelor degree in computer science and engineering from MIT. She was the recipient of the Apple AI ML PhD fellowship and is a rising star in EECS and RSS and HRI Pioneer, and has won Best Paper Award at HRI 2020 and the Emerging Research Award at the International Symposium on Mathematics of Neuroscience in 2023. Before MIT, she was also a research scientist at the AI Institute and an intern at NVIDIA in the Robotics Lab. So thanks once again for joining us, Andreea, and thanks everyone for being here. I'll let you start.
Well, super excited to be here today and excited to share with you a little bit about my work on aligning human robot representations. And for those who don't know me, this is me in a nutshell. I develop robot algorithms that learn from people from a variety of different forms of human feedback from them. And I do that because I really believe that if we want robots to not just exist in a vacuum, they have to be capable to adapt to the people that they interact with. For example, let's imagine this robot here called Jaco. And let's imagine that Jaco wants to carry this mug over to my colleague. And so to do that, it can generate trajectories xi that optimize some pre-specified reward function r. Now, typically, this reward function is parameterized by some parameter theta that sort of encodes a trade-off between important features phi of the task, things like cup orientation, distance to table, or efficiency. And so initially, Jaco starts caring only about being efficient, so it follows this sort of shortest path trajectory to its goal. But then I noticed that it's carrying the cup way too high above the table. So what I can do is I can push on it to correct it. And now the robot can use my correction to adapt to how I wanted the task to be done. So it updates this theta on the distance to table and generates a new trajectory that is sort of closer to how I wanted the task to be done when handing over the mug. So this is one example of robots adapting to people. And as Sylvia recently said, I did just finish my PhD at UC Berkeley just last year, where I had all these brilliant AI colleagues around me that similarly thought about getting robots to do hard tasks for people. And here in particular, they were looking into getting a robot butler that can serve wine to customers. And so they came up with this. So from an AI perspective, this robot here it's an amazing feat of robotics. You have this robot that can carry the glass incredibly fast. It doesn't spill a single drop of wine, and it doesn't break the glass. So it's really impressive. From a human user perspective, though, I don't know about you, but if this is how the robot served me wine, I would be pretty terrified. So you have this property where the robot achieves something that's really impressive in isolation, but it fails to consider things that real human customers would care about, such as not being terrified. So we're seeing amazing progress of robots in isolation, but they're still finding it difficult to kind of do their tasks in a way that's compatible with the people around them. And we see consequences of this gap in the news all the time. So on the left, there's this Uber crash in Arizona where the autonomous car fatally hit a jaywalking pedestrian for the simple reason that it didn't know or didn't recognize the wild concept of jaywalking pedestrians. It only knew about pedestrians at crosswalks. And on the right side, you kind of have the flip side scenario where this time the human pilot didn't know about this new feature that was designed into the flight control system. They couldn't understand what it was doing, which caused them to enter this tug of war, ultimately nosediving into the ocean. And so human-robot interaction is still really hard. And to understand the reasons underlying all of these failures and all of these gaps, I'd like to share with you an example of failed human-human interaction.
Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
So this child is clearly missing something, right? He's missing this concept of conservation of certain properties like count. And that's very normal. That takes a couple more years to develop. But without understanding this concept, the child is answering the questions incorrectly. And not only that, but he's able to then explain his wrong answers using all these other concepts he knows about that are actually unrelated. So in that sense, our robots are still a little bit like little children. Let's say that this time I want the robot to stay away from my personal laptop over here, but the robot has no notion, no feature for distance from laptops. And so without it, it can't learn well on from my push. And even worse, it latches onto all these other features that it knows about, similarly to how the child was latching onto all these other concepts that answer the questions. And so, in my view, our biggest obstacle for successful human-robot interaction is the fact that these representations are more often than not misaligned. And that's why I spent a lot of time in the past few years tackling what I call the representation alignment problem. How can we get robots to align their representations with those of the humans that they're interacting with and learning from? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so far, we've seen a more traditional solution to this problem, where we have a system designer that has all of this expertise about the task, and they use this expertise to kind of handcraft this representation as code, for example. And so then the robot can use this representation to just learn a reward function on top from human input, like the corrections that we saw, or there's many other kinds of human input out there. And then finally, the robot optimizes this reward, executes a behavior in the world. This is all great because we saw the robot was able to learn with just one push, which is super quick. But the problem is that it requires specifying every single thing ahead of time. And it's pretty unreasonable to assume that a human designer can think of what any human user for any task in any environment could possibly care about ahead of deployment. That's the problem with this. It's hard to actually specify these representations. They might say, well, why not just learn these features as well? After all, that is the main thing that the deep learning revolution has been promising us that it's been enabling. It's able to kind of tackle. And so let's try this. Let's try to kind of learn everything all at once and see what happens. So same scenario, similar scenario. Let's say that the person cares about keeping the cup close to this table that we just saw and far away from the laptop. And so if that's the reward function, spatially, we could visualize it and it would look something like this, where the reward is really low when you're right above the laptop and high above the table, and it gets better the closer to the table and farther from the laptop we look. And so let's say that the robot is missing some feature, the distance to laptop. And so deep learning tells us that no problem, we can just model what's missing with a neural network and concatenate it with all of the features that the robot does know about, and then collect some demonstrations of the human doing the task, and sort of use these demonstrations to both extract what's missing implicitly and also learn the reward function on top. And so this is what we get when we do this. It turns out we vaguely learned that being around the laptop is bad, but we don't really learn these more fine-grained causal details of the reward function. And the reason for this is that these demonstrations that we collect from the human, they're meant to teach the robot how to do the task. They're not meant to teach the robot about features per se. And so by trying to do everything at once, you're kind of hoping that you're going to be implicitly picking up along these missing features from the data along the way. But by doing that, by doing both things at once, deep learning ends up generalizing pretty poorly. And so the implication of generalizing poorly is that if I now try to optimize this reward function over here, I get this pretty suboptimal trajectory or pretty suboptimal robot behavior in contrast to how my human would like the task to be done. So as a summary, we have one paradigm that learns good rewards fast, but it requires handcrafting these representations, which is too burdensome. And then you have another paradigm that bypasses this burdensome feature specification, but does a pretty poor job generalizing. And so my question for today is, can we somehow bridge this gap? And so in my work, rather than assuming a representation or just hoping you'll pick it up along the way, a core idea has been that robots should just directly engage with humans in an interactive process for arriving at shared representations of their tasks. And this led to a divide and conquer approach to the robot learning problem. We said, why not focus explicitly on learning the representation itself from human input before using that representation to learn the downstream task for the robot learning problem? And so today I'll sort of share with you a quick taste of three components that make that kind of play a critical role in making this pipeline work. And I'll mostly focus on this first one, this idea of how do we learn representations from people? This doesn't seem particularly obvious. And to see that, let's come back to this example. And what if I didn't try to do everything end to end all at once? And instead, I did divide and conquer. And I first learned the feature itself that's missing from some sort of mystery human input about the feature. And only then try to learn the reward on top of all the features using inputs like about the task, like the demonstrations or the physical corrections we saw earlier. So that's what we're going to do. And so the question is, what is this representation-specific input? What is the data that people should give us to teach us about these features? Well, one idea would be to just naively ask the person for labels at different parts of the state space, sort of representing the feature value at kind of spanned across the state space. And so we can treat this as a direct supervised learning problem and sort of learn a neural network that defines the feature. But we have a couple problems with this. The first problem is that robot state spaces are pretty high dimensional. So to cover the entire state space, you would need a ton of data from people, which is too burdensome. But the second problem is that people can be pretty imprecise when labeling states directly. Something like 0.56 doesn't exactly come natural to us. It turns out we can tackle this second issue by instead asking people to provide relative labels, sort of comparing the feature value in pairs of states across the state space. And so then we can train that with what's called the Bradley-Terry model for pairwise comparisons, also via a supervised learning problem. The thing is that even so, you're still stuck with that first problem of needing to cover the entire state space. So you need a lot of data. So how do we solve this? Well, our take on this problem was that people are a lot more intelligent and capable than just giving 0-1 labels, so long as we give them the right way to give us data. And so what we wanted here was to come up with this type of input that is very information rich. It's very informative for the robot, but it's also very easy for the person to give. It's very effortless. And so our idea here was that we can pack a lot more information if we ask the person for a sequence of states with feature values that are monotonically decreasing. We call such a sequence a feature trace. And what's nice about this is that now the robot can automatically extract comparisons by exploiting this monotonicity property that we're introducing. And we'll see exactly, we'll dive a little deeper into this exactly in a few minutes. But first, in practice, if I want to teach the robot about this distance the laptop feature was missing, the way I would give a feature trace is I start the feature trace somewhere where the feature is highly expressed, so right above the laptop, and then I move the robot to somewhere where the feature is not highly expressed, so away from the laptop. And so I can collect a few of these traces from the person, and then the robot can learn a feature function that's kind of induced or defined by all of these traces. Okay, so how does it do that? We saw it in practice, but how do we use these feature traces to actually train the neural network feature function? Well, we said that we have a few assumptions, and so we're going to exploit these assumptions to convert feature traces into a data set that's more amenable to training neural networks. So the first assumption is the monotonicity assumption, where we said that the feature value kind of decreases along the states of a trace. So what this means is that I should be able to take any ordered combination of two states along the trace and label that as one because it's ordered, because I know that the first state should have a higher feature value than the second one because it shows up earlier in the trace. So that's great because for every one trace, I actually end up with a number of tuple comparisons that's quadratic in the length of the trace, which is a ton of data. So I might give you a trace for 3 seconds, but you're walking away with 200, 300 comparisons, which is really information rich. It's a ton of data for just 3 seconds of human effort. Now, the second property that we know about is that we should be able to relate the feature values across traces, because we know that all traces approximately start high, so the starts should be approximately equivalently high, and same for the ends. All traces approximately end low, so their ends should be approximately equivalently low. And this gives us equivalence tuples with this label of 0, 5 that symbolizes equal probability. I can't distinguish between the starts, I can't distinguish between the ends. And so now I have these two sets of tuples, and I can use them in a cross-entropy loss function and train my neural network feature function. So that's kind of how we go from feature trace to training. So now I'd like to share some examples of actual features that we learned using feature traces from both expert users, aka me on a physical robot, and also non-expert users in a user study in a simulator. And for all evaluations that I'll share with you, we sampled this large set of states in the robot's reachable set. So you have this 3D ball of points on the left, and we colored this 3D ball of points with the value of the feature that we were learning. So here we're showing distance to laptop, where you go from yellow to blue as you move away from the laptop. Something else that I can do to make visualization easier is I can project this 3D ball of points to a representative plane like here. So when we look at the ground truth distance to laptop feature, we see that this projected ball kind of decreases in intensity the farther from the laptop we look, which makes a lot of sense. And so when we trained our features with traces from the expert, we ended up with something that structurally looks very similar to the ground truth. And in fact, this result holds across multiple different features of varying complexity. I'm not going to go too in depth over what they are right now, but the important thing about this is that each of these features, we learned it with somewhere around 5 to 10 feature traces, which really isn't that much data or human effort if you think about it, but packs a lot of information for the robot. Now, we also wanted to know, can non-expert users, like not naive, but regular users that just aren't programmers or roboticists, can they actually give these traces and teach robots about the concepts or features that they care about? So we ran a user study, and so this is what we got for distance to laptop. We see that users also give these traces that start in the middle and then move away. And so we recovered this projected ball that looks very similar to the one on the previous slide. For something like distance to table, the users gave these traces that start, kind of trace the space vertically from up to down. And my personal favorite is this proxemics feature, which is this idea that people really don't like having things in front of their face more so than to their sides. And so users figured out that the way to teach this is to just give these traces that are longer in front of them and then shorter and shorter to their sides. And so you recover this projected feature bowl that kind of looks like a half ellipsis, which is consistent with my description of the feature. So we sort of saw this core idea in action of just robots directly asking humans about their representation. But asking the human for data is expensive. And so another key principle that maybe a more practical principle that was hidden in the details here was trying to learn a lot from a little. And feature traces were one such example where we created this data, this input that is packed with information for the robot, but it's very easy and quick for the person to give. And so I'd like to spend a few more minutes sharing a few more examples of learning a lot from a little and what this can look like in human-robot interaction. So one thing we try to do is we try to extend representation learning to higher dimensional inputs. So the robot state space is already pretty high dimensional. It can get up to like 100 dimensions, but it's even more complicated when you have higher dimensional inputs like images or point clouds. And so these inputs can be notoriously data hungry when you're trying to train any sort of neural network on top of them. And so our idea here for learning a lot from a little was to collect a small amount of labels from the human, but then amplify them using simulation. And so if the human wants to teach the near feature, they can label images as near or not near. And then we spawn many, many different objects in different poses in the simulator and augment these labels into a data set of thousands of examples for free. And so that enables us to learn these very robust features like objects being near or above each other that transfer to the real world without any additional human data. And again, all of the data was in a simulator to begin with. So we were kind of doing very scalable, like sim to real transfer here. We also looked at learning more complex, fuzzy, difficult to define features like emotion. And specifically, we wanted our robot to exhibit expressive behavior like these, like tiptoeing when it's afraid or stomping when angry. Emotion, though, is a very subjective feature and this very challenging feature to convey to our robots. But luckily, cognitive scientists have come a little bit to rescue and made this a little easier for us. And they found that all emotions live on this three-dimensional spectrum. It's called valence, arousal, dominance. And because of this really nice structure, we were actually able to learn a mapping from these expressive behaviors to this 3D space with just about 20 minutes of human labeling time, which really isn't that much time when you're thinking about the fact that you're labeling all expressive motions to a latent emotion space. And the bonus of this is that I can take this 3D representation and easily plug it into language models. And so we were able to generalize to novel expressive phrases like great weather today or didn't get the offer, which again, like the human never gave input about this. The robot never saw at training time these, but because language models are so expressive, we were able to sort of generalize out of the box. And as a final example I'd like to share, we also learned features using common sense priors like language models, LLMs. And here we had a human demonstrate throwing away the can in two different scenarios. And then we asked the robot, why are these two behaviors different? And to us, it's pretty common sense that the human didn't want to step on electronics, so perhaps distance to electronics is an important feature. And it turns out that LLMs are actually really great at finding hidden features like these, even though the human didn't say anything about it. All we had to do is we gave the LLM the description of these two behaviors, or like an actual textual representation of the two trajectories, and we asked it what's different, and it was able to infer that. And so we equipped the robot with this LLM algorithm, and it was able to generalize to new unseen situations without any additional feedback from the human. All right, so now that we've seen how we can learn features one by one, how does the robot even know when its representation is misaligned, when there's a gap in the first place? Going back to the scenario, remember that when the robot doesn't know about this feature, it kind of blindly learns to stay closer to the table. I don't want this to happen. Instead, is there a way in which it can autonomously figure out that my push refers to just something that it doesn't know about? Well, since when people act, they don't just do so randomly, we use the so-called Boltzmann noisily rational model from cognitive psychology to model people as selecting inputs in proportion to their exponentiated reward. And what's interesting about this model is this orange coefficient beta here, which models how rational or optimal people are. And typically this beta is fixed in robotics to be something reasonably high. So you're essentially assuming that humans are going to be reasonably rational, which is a reasonable assumption. But here we're explicitly trying to detect misalignment. And so we don't want to have this assumption. And instead, we kind of didn't fix beta. It means that we interpret it as a confidence for how well the robot's representation can explain the human input, and we inferred it along the way with the reward parameters data. So we kind of did joint inference of both beta and theta. And the result is that when the human and the robot representations are aligned, the robot will be able to estimate a high confidence on the correct intent theta that explains the human's input. And so with that, it can learn assuredly and kind of match what the human wants to do. But when there is misalignment, our algorithm was able to estimate low confidence across its representation because nothing stands out. Nothing is particularly consistent with what the human is doing. And so the robot is not going to learn from inputs that it doesn't understand. So back to our beginning example, when I push on the robot, this time it infers a low confidence, a low parameter beta, which maps to no longer incorrectly learning to stay close to the table. So notice that this time it's not updating this distance to table parameter, weight parameter. And so now the robot is able to stay robust to unintended learning. Importantly, this isn't something that we hand tune. This is something that the robot automatically monitors, and it can learn in proportion to this confidence that it estimates, which is what we did here. But something else it could do is it could say if the confidence is below a threshold and we are in safety critical situations, the robot may want to just raise a flag and say, hey, hold on, I'm going to stop execution. Human, please help me. So you can do many different things with this confidence parameter. And so now when we ran some user studies to compare the two methods. And so here we have we don't have misalignment, we have alignment. Both the human and the robot care about the distance to table in their objective function. So what you see is both methods are able to learn confidently and assuredly. There's no issues here. When things get interesting, though, is when there is misalignment. So here the robot doesn't know about distance to table, and instead it knows about cup orientation. And the robot incorrectly learns that the human wants the cup to be tipped over. And so not only does the human have to keep pushing down, but they also have to correct for the robot's incorrect learning and like correct the cup to be back upright. Meanwhile, with our method, we are estimating this beta parameter. Like the robot is able to figure out, hey, like my confidence is pretty low. I don't really understand what the human is doing here. And so what that means is that you can see that the robot isn't incorrectly tipping over the cup anymore. Obviously, the robot still doesn't understand what the human wants because we haven't taught it a new feature yet. But it just means that the robot can stay kind of robust to this misalignment and unintended learning. Kind of a closing thought on this section is that I just showed you, I demonstrated how we can detect misalignment when learning from corrections, but we actually demonstrated this idea in learning from demonstrations and learning from teleoperation shared autonomy feedback as well. And finally, to then properly learn from and interpret people's task input, the robot needs a model for how people make choices. We just saw this Boltzmann model in the previous work, Well, we actually found that this Boltzmann model was actually quite unintuitive, and perhaps a more natural model should use the human-aligned representation to adjust for any similarity that the potential trajectory choices have. I'm not going into detail here, but what we ran a user study and found that our model is actually closer to how people make choices in general, not just in robotics. So this has direct implication to other areas, not just robotics, to cognitive science or econometrics. And so now when we put all of these components together, we end up learning these reward functions that are much more generalizable with divide and conquer approaches than with this end-to-end approach that we saw in the beginning. And so now that the robot learned the correct features and the correct representation, it can do the task in the way that I want it. It stays close to the table and stays away from my laptop. So as a closing thought, we started by putting forward this vision of engaging with humans in this interactive process of arriving at shared representations. But this work that I shared with you today has only really looked at this very standard approach, or this one direction, which has the human in the teacher role, feeding the robot data about their representations. In reality, though, seamless human-robot collaboration demands more than just passive data absorption. This really should be a bi-directional process where the robot is an active participant in the interaction. And so when we think about what's next in this space, we've only scratched the surface, especially when it comes to fuzzier features like comfort or safety. But there are many other types of feedback to be discovered. Feature traces or labels were one example of such feedback, but there's many other things you can think about, like preferences, gaze, language, gestures, and so on. We can also imagine representation-specific tasks, sort of like calibration tasks that humans can do to implicitly tell the robot about their representation. And what I find most exciting and compelling is completing this feedback cycle, enabling both the human and the robot to share about their representations. So this involves interfaces for revealing parts of the robot's representation to the human, but also using tools from explainability to diagnose the representation and explain failures. And so all of these avenues are enabled because we're explicitly tackling representation alignment rather than just hoping it will naturally emerge. I'd like to thank all my collaborators, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Andrea.
Hi, wonderful talk. As always, I'm always excited to hear what you're doing. I had a question about what if there are things that either the robot or the human can sense, but the other one can't. So if my feature depends on like color, and my robot only has black and white cameras, how does that play out?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I only touched on this for like 30 seconds at the very end when I talked about we need multiple modalities of feedback. Feature traces or labels aren't enough, and this is one example where that could come in handy because you could have language and you could say, hey, by the way, this thing is yellow. And so that's why like one modality, what you're saying is essentially one modality, vision, fails me. How do I get information that this modality lacks? So something that we're working on right now is trying to combine multiple modalities, which may have each individual individually may lack information, but they kind of together, they have these complementary sources of information. So for example, in language, I could say apple, but I don't know what color of apple unless I get an image of it and I see, oh, this is a red apple. So this is super interesting to think about. We're working on in the lab. How do you combine or fuse together these multiple modalities of information to learn more effectively from the human?
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, a great talk. I really liked it about how to align the human representation with the robot. And I had a question whether you thought about how to handle when there's like, for example, like two people which have different thoughts in their mind, then how should the robot try to mediate or like how to handle those kind of conflicts between the people?
Yes. So let me answer it at the low level and at the high level. So at the low level, you could ask the question, how should the robot learn a feature, for example, if um, like let's say there's the proxemics feature. I have a different personal space bubble from you, maybe. Like maybe maybe I'm more conservative with my space. I want more space around me, and we want less space or whatever. So this is something that our algorithm enables, in that we're actually able to learn these personalized notions of, like, these personalized features, essentially. Like each person can teach their own notion of feature if they would like. Now, one other thing you might be thinking about is, well, hey, there's all this rage, or there's all this talk about foundation models these days. And so when you learn foundation models, you typically just aggregate data from a multitude of people on the internet. But as you're pointing out, different people want different things. So how do you aggregate this information correct? Like, what is that foundation model that foundation representation going to really contain? And that's actually, I think it's a big problem, because you're really, and you can look it up, you can read about it more. It's called mode collapse, but it's this idea that you're essentially learning a representation that kind of pertains to the average user or the average case human. We're kind of lacking information about the tail ends of the distribution. So basically, you're losing a lot of personalization. And so there's an important research question of, how do I fine-tune my foundation models or my representations to fit a specific user's needs and preferences and requirements and definitions. So this is the kind of low-level answer. And there's also high-level answer, or not high-level, but like there's another interpretation of your question, which is kind of a multi-agent interpretation of, hey, you have two people in this space. And let's say that they each have competing objectives. Like, I don't know, let's say that I am a human, I'm a guest in your home, and I don't care about their laptop. All I care about is for you to be super fast when giving me the coffee. Whereas the other human is like, oh, well, this is my precious laptop. I want you to like move slowly and carefully around it. So this is a bigger question of fairness. Like, how should you prioritize multiple different human objectives? Yeah, should the robot just say, hey, I am not, how do I say this? Not my owner, but like my kind of the human that I respond to in this home is the person two in my situation. Person two is the person I respond to. I should do things according to this person, and prioritize their preference. And there's something else you could say, which is, hey, I'm a robot acting in service of all people, so I'm going to try to kind of maybe add the rewards together, try my best to optimize both of them at once, or maybe can try to define a combined reward function or something. Does this kind of answer your question? Sorry, I kind of just like ran the gamut with what I could have interpreted your question as.
No, I think you gave some great directions on multiple perspectives, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I think it was very interesting. So I have a couple of questions. So how do you get the demonstrations? Are they kinesthetic demonstrations?
Yes.
Yeah. So
in our case, the demonstrations were kinesthetic, as in the human grabs the robot and
yeah.
traces a path.
So I noticed the trace plots which you showed, they only had the position information. Are you disregarding the orientation information?
Yes, that is just for plot purposes.
Okay.
No, the actual state space, or the actual state information that we capture in the state, is much more high dimensional than that. So we have the joint angles of the robot. So the robot is 7'd off, so that's 7 joint angles. We have the XYZ position of all the joints. So that's and the effector and all the other 6 joints. We have the rotation matrix for all of the joints. So that's
Okay.
like 9. Yeah, so like we have position, rotation, We have position of all objects. So,
Yeah.
when you enumerate everything, the state is 100-dimensional. Now,
Yeah.
for plotting purposes, we did for visualization tricks, we showed like 3D space, but
Okay.
just know
So
that the input to the neural network is much higher dimensional than that.
okay. So you try to keep the cup upright as it's trying to follow, like moving close to the table. Is that a constraint which you try to ensure that that's being satisfied, or it's just try to move as close to the table as possible?
Sorry, for which piece of work?
So do
Is this
you,
for the
so
first piece of work, or?
yeah, for the first piece of work, do you ensure that the cup should be upright as it's trying to move along the close to the table, or it's just that the cup should move close to the table? That's the only constraint which you have.
I think I technically think that in the first example I gave, the reward function cared about the distance to the table, so being close to the table and far away from the laptop.
Okay.
Like that was that specific example, but
Okay.
I mean, you could also encode a reward function that also keeps the cup upright.
Okay.
And we have done that. And in terms of features, we did learn the feature for cup orientation, and the way you
Okay.
do it is you kind of you start your trace upright and you rotate the end effector to point down. And so that's an example of a feature that doesn't operate in like position space. It operates in like rotation here. I suppose the thing that you need to learn here is the z the alignment between the z of the end effector and the z of the world or whatever, but it was
Okay.
able to learn that.
Okay. Okay. And the last question, is this, whatever you have done, is this specific to the robot, or I can take this and transfer it to say a UR5 and a Franca Panda and it would just work fine?
Oh yeah, it should work. Like to
Okay.
other manipulation robots, totally. I
So do I,
think it was something that I thought you were going to ask is how applicable is this to other applications, other types of robots like self-driving? I think, or navigation. I think you could probably teach stuff like in a simulator. Obviously, I can't like hop in a car or like it's annoying. I don't want to imagine what it would take to do that physically. I would probably want to use a simulator then, but you could imagine in a simulator you can learn like distance to obstacles or whatever. It's interesting to think of how do you give traces when to give a complete trace, you would need to cross safety boundaries. For example, let's imagine, I'm going to give an example in manipulation, but it's applicable to navigation as well. Let's imagine that the cup, I'm teaching you cup orientation, but the cup has water in it. Well, if I give you a full, I just described the best trace for this would be start upright, rotate down, like rotate the end effector. Well, I'm going to spill all the water. I don't want that. And so there's this interest, similarly in autonomous driving, like to learn distance to wall, say, you would need to give a trace that crashes into the wall. I don't want that. So there's this question of, well, could the robot maybe extrapolate? And like, I can only give you like part of a trace, like from here to here, but like extrapolate that by the way, like everything else is just not reachable or whatever. And we didn't run too many tests on that, but we ran some tests that showed that this kind of extrapolation is possible. So I wouldn't be surprised if it worked. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop talking, but I think this kind of extrapolation is possible.
okay. Can you define what you mean by misalignment? So is it like a difference in the features or difference in the values of the features? For example, if like the cup while it's moving close to the table, if there's a difference in what the human thinks is close to the table and what the robot actually thinks it's close to the table. So how do you define misalignment?
Yeah, so representation misalignment to me is what the human thinks is important for solving the task, so the features, is not the same as what the robot thinks is important for, like, yeah, for solving the task. So the robot's features are different from the human's features. And this is, it's easy to think of it as a feature set, but it doesn't have to be a feature set. In fact, we had a paper last year, I think. I forget when it was. We had a paper where we tried to define more mathematically how do we quantify misalignment or alignment? And so you can think of it as the feature embedding or feature representation. Could be an embedding, could be a feature set, what have you. But the feature representation of the human, minus, you could think of it as feature representation of the human minus feature representation of the robot. That's kind of your distance metric. So like you would try, for alignment, you would try to minimize that distance. The problem is that the phi of the human and the phi of the robot are probably not necessarily going to live in the same space. Like they're not going to be the same dimension. So what we kind of postulate in this paper is that you also need sort of a kind of like a translation function, like a function that translates between the human representation and the robot representation. So really what you want is PR, PH to be close to F of VR, where F is this mapping, this translation function that can bring them in the same space. Anyway, this is a little bit more abstract, but if you are interested in checking out like the most formal definition that we could come up with for representation, misalignment, or alignment, I would suggest looking at the paper from HRI. I think it was this year, HRI 2024. It's called Aligning Robot Representations with Humans. It's literally called something very similar to talk. Now you asked how do you define misalignment? So this is representation misalignment, and this is what I studied a lot. But there's also value alignment. There's value alignment community, which that is a little different because that says, is the reward function incorrect? The reward function that the robot has, is that incorrect or different from the reward function of the human? And the way I think of it is representation misalignment may result in value misalignment as well. But not all value misalignment comes from representation misalignment. Like you could have aligned representations, but you could still learn the wrong reward function or value function. So you might still have these gaps. So that's maybe the distinction you're asking about.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Let me use this opportunity to thank you for joining us today and sharing about your work and taking all these questions. I think we had a good conversation with the participants too. So hopefully it was an enjoyable experience for you as well.
Yeah, this is super fun. Thank you for having me.